Hi, my name is Tash. I'm reading for the MS Readathon, and today I'm reading Mrs Millies Painting by Matt Oatley. Mrs Millie lived with her very best friend Socrates on the top floor of an old building. Mrs Millie loved flowers. She often told Socrates about the beautiful garden she had played in when she was a little girl. But now she had no garden. Instead, she grew geraniums in pots by the window and painted wild, beautiful pictures of exotic flowers. Every year, Mrs Millie entered her geraniums in the flower show, but no one took much notice. Once she heard Miss Compost say, "I don't know why Miss Millie bothers. Her geraniums are pathetic." Mrs Millie pretended she didn't care, but that year she felt too ashamed of her geraniums to enter the show. Instead, she stayed at home and began a new painting. Socrates tried to help. "Clever cat," said Mrs Millie, "but you mustn't," and she gave him a bath. That night, while Mrs Millie and Socrates slept, something wonderful began to happen. "Goodness me," said Mrs Millie in the morning. "How very exciting," she said to Socrates. "Let's go exploring." The two friends climbed higher and higher into the morning sun. "Goodness me," said Mrs Millie, as she climbed through a fragrant valley carpeted with the very same flowers she had painted over the years. Distant music beckoned the explorers on. "How wonderful!" exclaimed Mrs Millie as they came across golden trumpet lilies, magenta flute tulips, and mysterious bassoon-like plants, all tooting and blowing just as the symphony finished. Socrates sneezed. A most mysterious perfume had drifted into the valley and filled the air. Sniffed Mrs Millie. "Let's follow our noses, Socrates." Soon they came to a tumbling waterfall. Socrates helped Mrs Millie cut down a giant leaf, and together they floated away down a stream that
Wound.
through dark tangled growth. "Stay close to me, dear," said Miss Millie. Eventually they drifted into a quiet, sunny pool from the most extraordinary flowers Mrs. Millie had even ever seen. Came the wonderful perfume. "Look, Socrates," cried Mrs. Millie. "The flowers are growing from my paintings." While Mrs. Millie was swimming, she had a brilliant idea. Before leaving the pool, the two friends collected a huge bunch of the beautiful flowers and made their way back through the valley. They arrived home at dusk as the air was filling with fireflies. Mrs. Millie stayed up half the night arranging her flowers. Early next morning she rushed down to the flower shoot, just in time to make a late entry. Everybody cheered as Mrs. Millie was awarded first prize. That night, while Mrs. Millie and Socrates dreamed of their triumph, something wonderful began to happen. "Goodness me," said Mrs. Millie, when she looked out of her window the next morning. "We'd better buy a bigger watering can, Socrates." The end.